You're live now.
Okay, hello and welcome to this webinar called COVID-19 and the Crisis of Capitalism, hosted by the Marxist journal GNIST as a part of the Norwegian Social Forum 2020. My name is Peder Østring. I'm a member of the editorial board at GNIST, and I will be hosting this meeting here today. We have the great pleasure to have with us the leading Marxist economist Michael Roberts, connected from England. Michael Roberts has worked as an economist in the City of London for over 30 years, where he has closely watched the global financial system from the inside. He's the author of several books, among others, The Long Depression, Marxism, and the Global Crisis of Capitalism. In a situation such as this, with a huge economic crisis, we could think of no better person to invite than yourself to give us a take on how and why all of this has happened, but maybe also to try and look into the crystal ball and say something about what might happen next and what should be the demands of the left in this situation. So I will give some practical information. This stream is transmitted live on the event page on Facebook. And after Michael's presentation, there will be room for questions from the audience. So simply write down your comments in the section under the live stream on Facebook at the event called COVID-19 and the Crisis of Capitalism. And without further ado, I will leave you the virtual floor, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Peder, and everybody from GNIST to invite me to speak. As Peder was saying earlier, it's a shame that I'm not able to do that physically. That was the original plan, to be in conjunction with the Norwegian Social Forum this year. But of course, as we know, a completely unprecedented event has taken on a world scale, a pandemic, a virus that has spread across the world and has forced most economies, if not all, into a position of lockdown and separation and the inability to hold, on the whole, large physical meetings. And that's still the case broadly across the world at the moment. So it's another webinar that we're taking place. I jumped in because I just saw a bird hit the window as I was speaking. But I just wanted to, this contribution I want to make to you is going to be in three parts. The first thing is to discuss what the state of the world economy was before the pandemic broke at the beginning of 2020 and starting in China. Because that's very important, because the argument often presented and will be presented that this was an event coming out of the blue, like an asteroid coming from another world and hitting the Earth and destroying everything, when in fact already the planet, the world economy was in a weak position and was unable and not in the shape to deal with this event, the pandemic, and the subsequent lockdown. So I want to deal with that briefly. Then I want to deal with the impact of the pandemic itself on the world economy and what that's meant around the world and why some countries have dealt with it better than others. We can discuss that. And finally, what's going to happen if and when the pandemic lockdowns on the whole are withdrawn, relaxed, and we return to an economy where people are in contact with each other, and you could talk about some semblance of normality, whether we actually will return to what was existing before. And as Peder said, we then need to think from the point of view of the labour movement and working people, what sort of economy we want to go back to and what we don't want to go back to after the end of this pandemic. Now, to do that, I'm just going to just bring a few graphs to you, if I can. So let me start by talking about the situation before the pandemic. In my book, The Long Depression, I argue that the period since the global crisis of the Great Recession, 2008-9, the financial crash, and the subsequent slump we had then, that for the last 10 years, most of the world's economies have been in a sort of depression. What I mean by that is they've not been able to grow at the same rate as before. Investment has been down, employment has been very slow in recovering, and in particular, real incomes have not increased. In my book, The Long Depression, I present this little graph, which you can see here. And if you notice on the top left-hand corner, that's what a recession is normally like. 74, 75, you go down, you come back. It's a V-shaped recovery and you return to the previous level of growth. Sometimes it's like a W, as in the 1980-82 one, but this period since 2008-9 has been like in the top right-hand corner, a reverse square root, if you like. There's a slump, a mild recovery, but we don't return to the trajectory of growth, investment, and incomes that we had before. There have been three sorts of depressions, in my view, that I've argued in the past. And in this one, 2008 onwards, we're in that sort of position. Before the pandemic even hit us, then growth was weak. And in fact, this period since 2008 was one of the longest expansions on record. This is the US expansion. You can see in the right-hand side of this graph, the red block. But from 2009, there's up to 140 months without any collapse in production or significant collapse in investment and so on. In fact, employment rose and unemployment rates fell in the United States and other countries. It was a long expansion, but it was the weakest expansion that we've ever seen. Whoops, something's gone wrong there, sorry. I don't know what's happened there. Oh, here we go. You can still see me there, Peder, I think. Yeah.
Yes, I can see you.
Yeah, it's not, doesn't want to move along. Let me see what, I don't know why. Maybe. Sorry about this, guys, but we seem to have a bit of an issue here. I may have to go in and come out again. Right, let's see. Okay, so being the longest expansion, but also the weakest. On this left-hand side of the graph here, you can see that a growth rate, the black line shows the growth rate in most of in the US economy in the period before 2000. It was growing at that sort of rate as on a per head of population. Then after 2000, the growth rate slowed to that gray line. So it was a slower growth rate. But from 2008, we drop into this blue line, a much slower growth rate. You can see the difference between the growth rate before 2000 would have taken the US economy to the position where every person per head would be producing a GDP of $80,000 a year. But in fact, it's only under $50,000 a year because of the slower growth rate. On the right-hand side, you can see that real per capita growth rate in the US economy started to collapse on the Great Recession in 2008-9, and the trajectory of growth way short of the trend after that. And in fact, as we hit the pandemic, the investment bank Goldman Sachs shows you where the level of GDP per capita will fall to in this current year, and where the new trajectory will start for the US. And we've seen a dramatic fall in productive investment too. On the left-hand side, we start with a growth rate up there of about 7% of GDP in real productive investment in the economy. That is the total amount of investment after just replacing the old equipment and plant, and that tells you the growth in real new investment in the economy. And you can see that that was up there at about a level of 7% or so before 2000, but you can see from the end of the Great Recession here, a dramatic drop in the ability to improve investment in the major economies around the world, even before we get to the pandemic at the bottom there. So that drop is the pandemic on the right-hand side. You can see growth rates are already half of what they were before 2000. And this is a measure of the growth rate of the real the rate of profit in the major economies around the world. This is a measure of the amount of profit capitalist companies are making relative to the amount of total investment they've made over a period of time, so against their stock of capital. And you can see the great period for capitalism was back in the 1950s and 60s, a very high rate of growth. Then there was a massive collapse in the profitability of capitalism from the mid-1960s to the 1980s. That led to a complete change of policy and activity on the part of the capitalists and their governments. And we entered the period here, where I've got the cursor, the so-called neoliberal period, as they attempt to exploit workers more, to privatize the economy, to try and boost the rate of profit, which has succeeded to some extent. But from the end of the 20th century, you can see that the world capitalist economy was struggling to boost profitability relative to the investments it were making. With the collapse in the Great Recession in 2008-9, we hit a very low level, only surpassed in depth by the 1980 figure. And since then, there really hasn't been any recovery in the rate of profit. So as we entered the pandemic at the beginning of this year, globally, world capitalism was struggling to be profitable by any stretch of the imagination compared to the 1960s. This is just emerging markets. It's the same story. High rate of profit over here, and then the great collapse in profitability during the 70s and 80s. And in the emerging markets, in this case, Argentina, Brazil, China, India, and so on, the peripheral big economies outside of the top capitalist economies of the world. And then you can see the neoliberal recovery is very weak in emerging economies. And since then, the rate of profit has fallen. So actually, these countries are delivering for the capitalists a rate of profit which has never been so low. They are in a very weak position, particularly before this pandemic broke. Now, here is Norway, which I worked out for your presentation. And you can see Norway is a lucky country. As you know, it's up at the top end of prosperity and of success in GDP per head. It's a very strong, if small, capitalist economy. And you can see that in the case of Norway, the reason it's an exception is because, as you well know, oil and gas is the key factor in the Norwegian economy in terms of its expansion and prosperity and its reserves and so on. And once you had the discovery of oil back in the early 60s, you can see that whenever the price of oil was high, you get a high rate of profit. When you get a low oil price, you get a low rate of profit. And you can see back just before the Great Recession, you had a peak level of oil price and a peak level of profitability. But since then, profitability for the Norwegian capitalist sector has declined quite significantly. So it too, even though it's a lucky country, was in a much more difficult position than it had been for many years before when the pandemic broke. And if you look at the real GDP growth rate of Norway here, you can see there's a general downward tendency, this black trend line, but you can also see just before the pandemic broke that growth rates were heading down below 1% on average as Norway entered the pandemic with the rest of the world. A very low level of growth rate compared to what was being achieved back in the 1990s. What you saw was also that the profits, because when I say that the profitability of capitalism has been low, many people say, well, that's a bit strange. What about Amazon? What about Facebook? What about all these other big tech companies in the US making huge amounts of profits? But the answer to that is, yes, those companies made huge amounts of profits, but they're the exception. If you look on the left-hand side of this graph, you can see that tech earnings, world technology earnings, are massively increased in the period, particularly since the Great Recession. But if you exclude tech earnings, then the rest of the capitalist companies have not had any improvement at all in their profits in the last 10 years. That applies both to the US and Europe, which is on the right-hand scale. So the concentration of profits is right in what is called the FANGs, Facebook, Alphabet, Apple, Netflix, etc. These companies have dominated the profit and the stock market that we've seen booming in recent period. Many other companies are in a much more difficult position. Here's a figure of what is called zombie companies. That means companies that only earn just enough profits to pay their employees and to service the interest on their debt. They have nothing else in order to expand investment, improve the productivity of the workforce, or to expand their business at all. And how many of those companies exist? Well, the latest figures provided by Deutsche Bank suggest that something like nearly 20% of American companies alone are in that position. That also applies to Europe. So it's a whole layer of relatively small to medium-sized companies that really make no profit at all and no real extra contribution to the development of the economy. And the only reason that many companies have survived is because there's been a dramatic increase in the level of borrowing by companies around the world. Interest rates have dropped dramatically because central banks have driven them down to zero. So there's been the possibility of borrowing money to keep going. It's almost a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is where you borrow money to pay for the previous debt, and then you borrow more money to pay for that debt. And so you never progress in actually reducing your debt or increasing your profitability to cover debt. You just keep borrowing more. So we've seen a massive increase in corporate debt. This is in the sector, not in the banks, not in the financial sector, not in households, which has also seen an increase in debt over these years. But I've aimed here, this graph shows the increase in the capitalist sector's debt, the corporate sector's debt as a percentage of GDP. Now up around, before the pandemic, at 90% of GDP compared to something like 60 or 70% just 20 years before. A very sharp increase, providing, as it were, support to a capitalist sector that's been struggling with a falling profitability. And you can measure that productivity of that debt, if you like. And this is the way, what does this graph mean? It means it measures the level of growth return per unit of debt added. So for every unit of borrowing carried out by the corporate sector, how much extra growth and production do they achieve? Well, the answer is, when you put it on the fraction of debt versus growth, you can see that it's dropped from the growth rate per unit of debt has dropped from 8% back in the 1990s to almost zero before we got to the pandemic. So there's the whole of the capitalist economy in general has low profitability, low productivity, and a very large level of debt that's been built up over the last 10 to 20 years. That was the state of the capitalist economy before the pandemic. And that also affected the ability of the capitalists around the world to expand world trade. World trade before the Great Recession of 2008-9 was averaging nearly 6% a year, even faster than the world economy was growing. So it was a place for people to expand production by exporting if they were not doing so well at home. But since the end of the Great Recession, the average growth rate in world trade has dropped to more like 2% before the pandemic hit. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side of this graph, that it's, with the pandemic, it's just collapsed almost back to the levels of the Great Recession period that took place in 2008-9. So world trade has declined in terms of its ability to grow and provide markets for capitalist economies and for capitalist companies. Profitability is low, debt is high, productivity is poor. And in a way, this is the end of globalization. You probably know a lot about the fact that there's a lot of talk in the neoliberal period since the 1980s of the expansion of world trade, world investment, opening up world economies so that cheap labor can be used by the advanced capitalist economies companies to expand and increase profitability. That means that you need an expansion of trade, the reduction of tariffs barriers and other protectionist barriers, the European Union developing and so on. Now we can see that that has really come to an end before the pandemic breaks, starting with the end of the Great Recession, a slowdown generally in the expansion of globalization. And just before we entered the pandemic in 2020, towards the end of 2019, it was clear that a major recession was going to happen, in my view, anyway. Global corporate profits is key to whether capitalism invests, whether capitalists invest and expand. and global corporate profits, this is my measure, had actually fallen below or at zero by the time you get to 2019. You can see big booms and swings around in the corporate profit growth rates over this 20-year period, but you can see how low it was just before the pandemic erupts. So that already the global capitalist economy was in a very weak position, not able to withstand a very sharp shock, which is exactly what happened with the pandemic. And so we have the pandemic. I just briefly now want to explain where the pandemic comes from, because it's, as I said before, it's not coming out of the sky. It's not an event which could not have been predicted or warned about, because it certainly could have been predicted and warned about, this particular pandemic, and maybe future ones too, because there have already been some already. But so we have a weak capitalist economy, and then we have this massive hit coming from the virus. And we have to understand that this virus is just one in a series of pandemics that have already happened and will happen again, because through the rapacious expansion of capitalist production around the world, this globalization process, through the uncontrolled logging, resource exploration, urbanization, industrial farming, the wildest parts of the world have really come now into contact with human beings, and in particular also through farm animals as well. So we have a position where what used to be very dangerous pathogens, which were in wild animals in remote areas, bats apparently is one of the big incubators of such pathogens, never coming into contact with human beings, but now, because of the rapacious expansion and the destruction of nature around the world, deforestation and so on, that has happened. So we've resulted in the position where these pathogens have gone from wildlife into animals, farm animals, industrial farm animals, and into humans as well in a series. And epidemiologists and virologists around the world are emphasizing how dangerous this is going to be over the next period. This is the product of capitalist expansion that's been uncontrolled. And that is why it is not going to go away, even if this pandemic does. I mean, the UN has a monitoring body called the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. They looked at pandemics and they only warned governments last September that there was a real danger of a new dangerous pandemic, a virus that will be would damage human life and health, and will be impossible to control unless action was taken. But as this quote says, they didn't really respond to the risk of a health crisis, and most countries didn't devote the energy and resources needed to keep outbreaks from escalating into disasters. What we've seen actually, I don't know if this applies to Norway, but it certainly applies to most advanced capitalist countries. Over the last 20 to 30 years, the health and public services systems have been reduced in resource, in financial support, and in providing the buffers for dangerous things like these emergencies which appear. Many hospital systems are we're operating at 95% of capacity before the pandemic broke, because that was supposed to be efficient and cost effective. There was no room for such a disaster to take place, no equipment to handle it in many countries, and no preparation for the danger. In particular, there was no attempt to prepare for these pandemics by introducing vaccines. The big pharma companies around the world have done little or no research in antibiotics or antivirals. Of the 18 largest US companies, 15 have totally abandoned the field of looking at vaccines and antibiotics and antivirals for these dangerous viruses before the pandemic broke. Instead, they wanted to go for the more profitable things in heart medicines, tranquilizers, and so on. And therefore, they had no basis for which to protect humanity around the world against hospital infections, emergent diseases, and tropical killers. And a universal vaccine was not available either for this virus or for earlier ones. Influenza, for example, has a vaccine, but it's not very effective. There's not been the proper research in it in order to try and reduce its influenza's impact upon people every year. let alone the new pandemic. So I just want to also say that I only heard the argument yet again today that COVID-19 was a complete hoax. It was a waste of time. We didn't need the pandemic to worry about the pandemic. We didn't need to worry about the lockdown. We didn't need lockdowns because really it's no worse than flu. Well, the evidence is pretty clear that it is much more dangerous than flu. Flu kills about 0.1% of people every year. It's somewhat dangerous to a small section of the population. The hospitalization rate is, say, about 2% of anybody who catches the flu. It takes a shorter period of time before the incubation is over and the symptoms disappear and you're not infecting anybody else. COVID-19 is completely different. The infection rate is probably 2 or 3 times higher than it is with flu. The incubation period is longer, so therefore it's likely to infect more people. And the hospitalization rate so far has been as high as 10 to 15 or even higher percentage rate. And the death rate also is important. According to the very latest studies, as I say, flu kills 0.1% of the population infected. The latest this year is about 3% for COVID so far on the cases. By the time everybody gets it, or a large number of people get it, then probably that infection death rate will fall to something like 0.5 to 1%. Quite small, but if you imagine that 65% of the world's population gets it, and the death rate is between 0.5 and 1%, which is 5 to 10 times more dangerous than influenza, you're going to have something like 35 million people die. Of course, that's not going to happen because we have had a tremendous effort to try and contain this by various governments in the period of the lockdowns and other measures by the health service. I had a little quote there on the left. You can see the attitude of those people who regarded this as no worse than flu, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who said that only 800 people died from flu in 2019, so there's nothing to worry about. Now, of course, Brazil has got 120,000 deaths already from COVID. So that it's not correct to say that COVID-19 is not a more deadly virus or a pathogen than annual flu, and the death rates prove that to be the case. So most governments were forced, not all, but virtually all governments were forced to introduce massive lockdowns, sending people home, closing down businesses, isolating people, particularly old people and sick people, who it now appears are the most vulnerable to this particular pathogen. Other pathogens affect young people, but this one seems to affect the old and sick or the unhealthy. Those countries that have bad health systems couldn't cope with this, so a lockdown was forced. Those countries that didn't have the equipment ready and the government ready to do that and didn't have the medical services were forced into lockdowns. I think it's probably correct that if we'd had a really robust health system around the major economies, that we had all the resources, both people, skills and so on, and also knowledge about the treatments that would be necessary to help people who have to be hospitalized with the respiratory impact of COVID, that we could possibly have avoided these really severe lockdowns and had something less. But the example of Sweden proves that just going for social distancing and just going for relying on people to act in a reasonable manner and avoiding mass events was not going to be enough if you don't have the knowledge and the health systems in place. So in particular in Sweden and in the UK, large numbers of older people in residential homes died because there wasn't the protection for them by the health system and because the governments didn't operate lockdowns in an effective way. And that's still the case for a lot of people. So the lockdowns, of course, have led to a dramatic fall in GDP. This is an unbelievably large fall in GDP for most of the major economies across the world and all the small ones. We've never seen such falls of 15 or 20% in just a couple of quarters of 2020 compared to previously. You can see on this graph how severe that already has been. It means that 90 to 95% of all the world's economies, and it's about 130 countries, are now in recession. We've never had that level of countries in recession before. not even in the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the impact of the pandemic economically, apart from people dying, has been the absolutely unprecedented in the history of capitalism, going back at least to the periods of the cholera epidemics in the early 1800s. And here is the very latest figure in the second quarter of this year, just gone to the end of June, of each country's decline, or at least most countries, advanced countries, decline in GDP from the beginning of the year compared to the same period last year. So Spain has fallen by nearly 23% its GDP compared to this time last year. The UK, nearly as bad, and then you can go back and forward. Note, just one country has not experienced a fall in GDP compared to this time last year, and that is China. China was the one that had the COVID virus first, but it applied a very severe lockdown straight away, isolated a region, had a mass testing public system in order to control the virus, and was able reasonably quickly to come out of the lockdown in the second quarter of this year, and the economy has begun to recover. That is not applied to most of the Western capitalist economies, and of course not in the big emerging economies. Some of this graph is missing some of the key countries which are suffering even more. Brazil is there. India has just recorded a 17% fall. In fact, I think it was even higher than that in the latest quarter. And of course, there's been a dramatic drop in employment. People have been laid off or furloughed. The level of employment has fallen by anything between 15 and 50%, depending on the country, up until June 2020. And that may not improve much over the last month or two. In case of the US, we had a level of unemployment which eventually reached just under 35 million. That's fallen back a bit now to somewhere like 20 million. So we've got 1/3 back from the loss of employment and jobs for the US workers at the moment. There's still a very long way to go before you can return to what might be considered normal. And will people have jobs when they go back? Because companies are going bust as fast as this pandemic continues and the lockdowns last. And this, for the first time, applies most severely to the emerging economies of the world, so-called emerging economies, the poor countries of the world. For the first time since records have been to measure the growth rates in these countries, there's going to be a slump in those countries, as you saw from the previous graph. This is the first ever slump in developing economies since reliable records began. And that includes China. That blue line includes China, which has been growing at 6% before this and has now recovered quickly. All the other, China is the biggest economy in that measure, and yet if it's included in that, so we strip that out, then the fall will be even greater for emerging economies. What has been the solution offered in policies by the governments of the big capitalist economies? Well, the first thing is dramatically to expand the liquidity, to provide banks, companies and others with huge amounts of borrowing power. They can borrow money, they can get loans directly from central banks. The central bank gives money to banks to lend on to businesses at very low rates or cheap rates. So there's been a massive expansion of credit. What has happened to most of that money? Well, a lot of that money didn't go to the small businesses who need to struggle. It's gone to the big companies, the airlines, the travel companies, other sectors of the big industries, big companies in those other sectors. And what they've done with it, many of them have been cash rich anyway, they've simply used that money to speculate in the stock market. So we've seen a dramatic rise in the American stock market. It first collapsed, as you can see in this blue line here, when the pandemic hit, but has now recovered to unprecedentedly record levels for the stock market as the money has been pumped in free for big companies and hedge funds and other investment institutions to invest in the stock market. So it hasn't been used on the whole to restore the smaller companies involved. There's been a huge government spending program, partly to, luckily, to provide cash handouts to workers who have been unemployed or furloughed, but also huge amounts of grants and handouts to big business. I estimate that take the US figure, which is about here, 8% of GDP has been in fiscal packages. 2/3 of that has gone to businesses, particularly big businesses, and only 1/3 to workers and their wages, or to the local councils and so on. That varies in different countries. You know, Denmark is the leading exponent of this fiscal package. I'm not sure Norway's on that list, but the Scandinavians have also spent. But you can see that generally the fiscal packages have gone to some extent to workers, but mostly to business, particularly big business. But this level of fiscal spending has never been seen before in 1 year. Over 4 to 5% of GDP, world GDP, has been pumped in by governments to try and support workers and businesses during this pandemic. 5% of GDP, that's 5 to 6 trillion, probably 7 trillion will have been spent before the year is out in trying to do that. That's something like twice or 3 times bigger than the fiscal stimulus in the Great Recession. Yet, nevertheless, large numbers of companies are going bust, particularly small ones. This is the level of bankruptcies in the US already. You can see it's matching the Great Recession, and we're not even halfway through the year. These are all those small companies, particularly in entertainment, leisure, cafes, retail, all those sort of areas, all those small businesses have got no future. They're going bust despite the support we've had up to now, because people are not going to be returning to spend their money in these places. So there's going to be a significant break in the level of employment, particularly in these businesses, and no prospect for them to change. So I come to my third part, Chair. I hope I'm not taking too long, but I want to deal now with after the pandemic. What will happen after the pandemic? Pandemic is not over, but the lockdowns are being relaxed in most parts of Europe, and in North America, it's up and down all the time. Every country is trying to find a way to come out of the lockdown so they can expand their economies. Let's assume for a moment that the level of infections falls. It's not much at the moment because it's spread to India, Africa, of course in Latin America. But it's true that death rates are coming down. That's because old people are sitting at home and not getting infected, and because health systems are now more effective in trying to treat people once they're hospitalized and they're not dying and surviving. All I would say is that lots of people are being left with long-term damage to their bodies as a result of the COVID if they get it seriously, much worse than in flu. And so is the economy being scarred. The world capitalist economy is being scarred by this huge shock to the system that has continued. Incomes have been permanently lost. Here's the International Monetary Fund's estimate of incomes. You can see at the point here is where we were at the beginning of the pandemic in 2019, the level of GDP. And then by the middle of this year, that had dropped by 5 or 6% on a world scale. And the argument is that the trajectory of recovery, which is now taking place, will not return us to this black line at all. Up at the top here, this blue area will be permanently lost. This is the amount of output, employment, incomes that could have gone to people's prosperity will disappear completely because of the lower level of growth and the fall that took place in the first 6 months of this year. And there are several reasons to not to expect a V-shaped recovery, which is what I talked about at the beginning, a straight V. In fact, we're going to have this slow recovery like a reverse square root. First thing is that so many countries have gone into slump that they have an impact on each other. And there's no escape from it. There's a spillover from one country to another. So take China, for example, which is recovering now. It's making some improvement, but it can't return to the same level of growth because it can't export anything to anybody when other countries are still in a slump. And that's the impact that lots of countries are having on each other. Also, generally, world trade volume has been dramatically dropped and doesn't seem any prospect of it recovering in such a way to provide an escape for many countries. And as I said before, because productive investment per head and profitability were already at all-time lows, then it's very difficult for economies to recover when if they're based on a capitalist process of production and investment, when profitability is so low. So investment will stay low, so employment will not recover quickly, and economies won't recover. So when you have the largest yearly decline in per capita GDP in the last century and a half, it's not surprising that there's a destruction permanently of assets and wealth, which will take time to repair. And as I say before, huge amounts of debt before the pandemic are now going to be even doubled up more, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And we've just seen that the pandemic is not over. New cases are still very high. This is probably out of date. I think it's moved up a bit more. And the activity in the economy is also not really recovering. You can see that that was the depth of the drop in activity in global economies. This slide is upside down just for that purpose. And you can see it's recovered to some extent, but it's still well short of returning to the level of February 15. That recovery plateau in all these countries here. Norway's in this one. I think it looks as though it's the one up here near the top. So even Norway, which has done better than most, is still 20% below the level that existed before the start of the pandemic. And other countries are even 40% low as we go into September. And as I say, the huge amounts of deficits that have been built up by fiscal spending means that there's something like 25 to 30 trillion in government deficits now, equivalent to 30% of global GDP, which governments will now have to find ways of financing, which of course they're doing by borrowing, that is either printing the money or asking the capitalist sector to buy government bonds. So there's going to be a dramatic increase in public debt, which was already high. You can see that it was back to almost the levels of the Second World War here. Now as we enter 2020 and the great lockdown, public sector debt is going to be something like, on average, 130% of GDP in the major economies around the world. Cases like Japan, it's 260%, Greece, 200%, and so on. But a sharp increase. And even the emerging economies, which have not been able to run up the same level of government debt, are showing a big increase. Now, if interest rates are zero, maybe that doesn't matter, because the cost of running that debt, if you've got a mortgage on your house, even if it goes from 100,000 to 200,000, if the interest rate drops from 4% to zero, you're not paying any more interest or no interest at all. So you can have as much debt as you like because you can fund it. Well, that's not true, because there's always some interest you have to pay. And if the debt level rises right up here, then you'll have an impact on the interest cost relative to what available resources you have. So this is looking at the public sector. So you're going to see an increase across the board on average for the costs of the government to service the huge extra debt it's got in interest payments to the people who have bought the bonds that the governments have issued. Does that matter? Yes, because that 10% of GDP out of means, which is just going to the interest to pay the people who own these bonds, means you've got less to spend on public services and so on as a result of the increase in interest in your budget. So there is an impact, which means that going down the road, governments at the moment are going to have less money to spend on public services and so on to sort out the health system and so on that we would need in the period recovering from the pandemic. And as I say, there's this massive trade calamity which has taken place. You can see the growth rate in trade is the dotted line. Then we get before the Great Recession, then we get the collapse in the Great Recession and much slower growth in the dotted line. The yellow line is now the trajectory of world trade, much slower, the gap has widened, and then the pandemic hits, and we can either drop down probably to this level, 70% below where we were in 2019 in world trade, and a very gradual recovery. So we have, same thing applies to GDP as trade. You drop down in a period before, then you get a double hit from the pandemic, and the growth rate is even lower. And this gap, which I talked about before, becomes huge. There's no way that you can recover to the same level if you have that level of very slow growth. Here is a figure of Norwegian GDP. And the reason I brought that in is you can see at the top here, about 2008, before that, there was a steady growth in Norwegian GDP. And then you get the position where it flattens out. Productivity, so it's the productivity of Norwegian economy flattens out quite sharply as we come up to 2020. So already Norway, even Norway, is on a lower trajectory before the pandemic, and this can only make the situation worse. Here's the productivity figure. You can see productivity in Norway is strong up until the Great Recession, then it flattens out, and now it's been recovering just before the pandemic, but below the original trajectory that it had before. It seemed you might get back there. Now the pandemic is going to drive that further down. And here is the trade balance in Norway. You can see that running oil and gas exports and production has meant that Norway has generally had a very strong trade balance, particularly in the early 2000s, or it was more or less flat before that. But now, in the latter period just before the pandemic, that trade balance moved down towards negative territory as the oil price collapsed. So if the oil price continues to be very low, it's around $40 a barrel, same with gas prices, then revenues that are going to come in to the Norwegian economy are going to be sharply down. And yet, of course, that means bad news for the ability of the economy to purchase things from abroad in order to maintain its level of investment and consumption. So Norway could be heading into a deficit period for the first time. We haven't really seen that in the Norwegian economy before. And that's because of what's happening with crude oil production. Not only is production declining, and because going ahead, if we're going to deal with fossil fuels as a danger to climate change around the world, then we need to get the production of crude oil down. This is Norway's crude production oil. It's in decline up until the period of the Great Recession, and that means they can't. Not only is the price low, but also the ability to sell more is falling down. Norway is if you like, based on oil and gas. To use an American phrase, it's a one-trick pony. Obviously, there's other parts of the Norwegian capitalist economy, manufacturing, other areas of services and so on, but it's still key as a percentage of mainland GDP now. Oil and gas exports are actually into negative territory. It's now become a detriment to the Norwegian economy for the first time from many ahead. Well, it will be soon. So at the moment, it's still 15% of mainland GDP. But you can see as we progress over the rest of this next 50, 20, 30 years, you're going to go into negative territory. Norway cannot continue on the same policies it had before after this pandemic. Wage growth has already gone down sharply before the pandemic. It actually fell into negative territory here from 2015, just staggered above the level of 2% across that board there. And so the growth rate in wages, which before 2013 was up around 4.5%, is now on average around about 2%. That shows the increasing difficulty to maintain the very high living standards that the average Norwegian would have. Inequality in Norway, as you well know, is very high. Households of the 10% of the population have something like 50% of net wealth. The richest 1% control 21%, and the very, very, very top billionaire or near billionaire types control 10% of total net wealth in Norway. And like many countries, although Norway, after social transfers, has a relatively low level of inequality, if you exclude the transfer process, so that didn't take place, if you didn't have redistribution through taxes and social transfers, actually the inequality index in Norway is very high at 0.45, which shows that the actual structure of the economy benefits the richer wealth owners and income owners in society to the detriment of the people lower down the ladder with no wealth and much poorer incomes. Inequality in Norway on the basis of the market economy is very high. If you didn't have that redistribution process as is in tradition in the Scandinavian economies, then it would be just as high as it would be in the US. And that's what redistribution has achieved. And there is a level of hidden poverty. You can tell me more about this, but in the last 4 years, the proportion of poor in Norway has increased from 7.7% to 9.3%. That's on the basis of OECD measures, where there's more, where you've got less than 50% of the average income is the measure of poverty. In Norway, in Oslo, 17% of all children are in such an area, and it's something like 45% of immigrants fit into that category. Yes, many other countries are worse than this, but it's an indication of the problems ahead, even for an economy like Norway, if something is not done about it. I'll finish on this, Chair, that what's the prospect? Are we going to have slow, gradual, weak, depressed growth that we've seen over the last 10 years as we come out of this pandemic? Or is the destruction of so many of these small companies and weaker companies create the conditions where the big companies, the Amazons of the world, can suck up all those small companies and take over a bigger share of the market and boost profitability in general? The argument of Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist of the 1930s, was that slumps kill off monopolies and create conditions for smaller companies to innovate. Well, Marx's view was different from that. He says slumps kill off the weak and the small, allow the more efficient and large to consolidate and become more profitable. And I think we'd have to clearly say that Marx's approach towards destruction out of a slump is more accurate for this current environment. We're not going to see smaller innovative firms flourish. We're only going to see the very big firms take over the weak. And with central banks buying all the debt and corporate bonds, and with many companies getting low-cost capital, we're going to see much more like a consolidation with less innovation and the continued presence of zombie companies. So, in my view, more likely to have a depressed world economy like we've seen over the last 2 years, and possibly even more depressed than we've seen over the last 10 years. Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, said recently that the pandemic has been likened to an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies that we've built. It's exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. And these were what he said that were fallacies and falsehoods. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all. Well, that has been proved. In the countries where there is no public healthcare, or it's secondary to private healthcare, there's been a shocking impact of the COVID-19 in countries like India and other places, South Africa and so on, where the private sector, particularly in Latin America, where people have to pay for their health, that's been the case. Free markets have totally failed to protect the population and deliver healthcare for all. There's a fiction that all that care work is not important work, but people would have died without care work, care work at home, looking after relatives, but also paid care work. Low-paid care work has been at the front line in protecting people. And the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, well, I don't need to tell you about that after what we've seen the events in the US and elsewhere in the recent period. And the myth that we're all in the same boat. Obviously not the case when the rich have improved their conditions under the pandemic on the whole, while those who have been on the front line, keeping things going in the health service, in delivery service, and elsewhere in the basic public services, have been hit by the COVID and also not been received the remuneration and gain that they ought to be in society. I ask you this question, everybody. Which is more important? Hedge fund managers, marketing executives, management consultants, or health workers, delivery workers, transport workers, manufacturing workers? Which is more important to an economy and the needs that we have? Clearly, the ones I referred to at the beginning are totally unimportant. We don't need them at all. And yet those are the ones that have probably survived best out of this slump. We're not in the same boat. It's time for global leaders, says Antonio Guterres, for us to choose between chaos, division, and inequality, or are we going to right the wrongs of the past and move forward? Well, I think we could say that the world economy, the leaders of the world economy now have no intention of doing anything about chaos, division, and inequality. And they're not going to right the wrongs of the past and move forward. So it's up to us in the labour movement in the organizations of working people to do something about it. And what are the big problems ahead? Well, inequality, which we've just discussed, is dramatically high, way higher than we've seen in 100 years. Poverty, 3.4 billion people, nearly half the world, still live on less than $5.50 a day. And that figure hasn't declined since 1990, according to a recent UN report. Global warming and climate change. 1 in 5 chance now that the annual global temperatures will hit the level which is regarded as so dangerous to produce floods, droughts, devastation, earthquakes, and so on. We're moving into that. The collapse of the glaciers and the Arctic ice is going to raise sea levels and cause catastrophe across the world in a very short period of time now, according to the latest estimates by scientists. And as I said, we began this discussion with the environmental destruction, which is going to create the conditions for more pandemics. We need to reset the economy, but not the way the capitalists want it. We need a global plan for full employment with jobs for all. Pensions for those who cannot work must be raised to a reasonable level, so if people can't work, they can still have a reasonable life. We need to increase public investment in services and infrastructure in the key areas which have been so neglected for the last 30 years. We need to begin to put investments in harmony with nature and the planet. The fossil fuel industry has to be phased out, just as the military should be phased out, so those resources can be used to improve the conditions of people, renew the economy, and avoid global warming. We need to cancel the debts of the poorest countries exploited by the multinationals in the imperialist countries. I have to say, Chair, that nothing has been done about the debts of the poorest countries at the moment. The IMF says it's going to get debt relief, which means reducing the time to pay, but not to cancel those debts. The private sector owners of poor countries' debts have refused to do anything at all about the levels of debt that these poor countries have and will increase as a result. We need to end the tax savings for the rich and powerful, that 0.01%, to hide their money in tax havens around the world and pay no tax. We need to increase taxation so that we can reduce inequality in the areas where it matters. And above all, in my view, we need to have public ownership of the major financial institutions and multinationals so that the world can be planned in the interests democratically of society's needs and not for the profit of the big multinationals around the world.
Thank you so much, Michael, for a very thorough and insightful presentation. You touched on several very important issues, and the first thing I'd like to ask you is that we have this concept that we take from Marx with the theory of the about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Could you give the audience a brief explanation of this theory and whether or not you think it's relevant for our understanding of this current conjuncture?
Okay, well, everybody I think recognizes, as they should do, that capitalism doesn't expand production, employment, incomes on a harmonious basis. The world is unequal, it's uneven in its development, but more than that, on a regular and recurring basis, there are slumps in production and investment and therefore employment and people's incomes. This presentation has mentioned the Great Recession of 2008-9, which is a very severe slump. We're now in another one 10 years later. But if you go back into the 20th century and into the 19th century, indeed from the beginning of industrial capitalism, you can see a regular and recurring cycle of boom and slump in capitalism. Well, why is that? Why is there this boom and slump? Before capitalism existed, people had terrible periods of famine and scarcity of food and of lack of production. But now it appears you can have a slump in production when people are prepared to work but can't, and yet capitalists are not prepared to produce because they claim that they cannot make any money out of it. And that's the key. The key under a capitalist system is capitalist companies only produce if they make a profit. And they need to continue to compete to make with each other to make that profit. How do they compete? Well, they can try and pay their workers less money. They can employ more workers at a cheap rate to compete against other capitalists. But there's a limit to that, because if the other capitalists come in with an idea which saves money on employing labor and so on, perhaps a new piece of machinery, or of course in modern times, maybe robots that replace workers completely, they can dramatically reduce their labor costs. If they can do that, they can employ less labor, they can boost the productivity of the existing labor force by using machinery and get a much higher level of production for a much lower cost, so they can out-compete their other capitalists in the course of that. So they can take the profits that are available in the market from the other capitalists by being more efficient, more effective because of their technology. But that means everybody else, all the other capitalists, want to do exactly the same thing. So they want to employ this new technology where their competitors have got an advantage. So everybody starts using the same technology in order to regain their market share. So that what do you have at the end of that process? You have at the end of that process less people working and more machinery, plant and equipment being used relatively in the process of production compared to workers. So you have a rise in what Marx called the ratio between the machinery and plant invested by capitalists and the amount they invest on workers. So you have a rise in this composition. Now, Marx said what that means is if you believe that the only way you can get a profit is if people work, if nobody works, there's no production and there's no profit. Labor creates the value that capitalists have. Labor creates work, they produce things, it's sold on the market. The capitalist owns what's sold on the market. It owns the factory, the office, assets, and all the workers have is their ability to work. So they produce the profit and the work and the production, and the capitalists appropriate that. But if you reduce relatively the amount of workers you're using because you're competing against other capitalists and investing more in technology, machines don't produce any value. They only produce value if workers use the machines. We haven't moved to a society where there are no workers at all yet. That's another matter. But that means that the relative composition increases relative to machinery to labor. There's less labor being employed, so there's less value being created. So there's a tendency for the total value produced to fall relative to the total investment that each capitalist is making overall. So there's a tendency for the profit relative to the investment to fall. So the rate of profit tends to fall. And that's the fundamental reason, not only why capitalism struggles, but also why it enters these regular 10-year so intervals of collapse, boom and slump. When profitability declines sufficiently, that actually profits start falling and there's too much investment for capitalists to make any money. Relatively, they stop producing, they stop investing, they start laying off workers. There's a cascade of effect across, and we enter a slump. When that slump ends, when enough capitalists either go out of business or are taken over, or enough workers are got rid of, that the remaining capitalists can then begin an expansion. So as we go into 2020, we see a dramatic drop. We're going to see lots of small companies go to the wall. The big companies will suck up that extra possibility for the market, maybe, and then they will start to expand. That's the traditional recovery of boom and slump. Unfortunately, in this case, it may not even be that, because we seem to be in a depressed period. So I argue that Marx's law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall is key to us understanding booms and slumps in the world capitalist economy. Other people argue somewhat differently. They say it's because workers don't have enough money to buy all the goods. Well, no, workers never have enough money to buy all the goods, so there would never be any boom at all, because everything would stop if we had to rely on workers buying all the goods, because workers are not the only people who buy goods. Other capitalists buy other goods from capitalists, so there are two buyers for capitalist production. And so that's not the reason for slumps. The reason for slumps lies in what's happening with profitability. That's why in my presentation, I present to you a lot of graphs about profitability and what's happening with that, because that explains to us better what is happening to the health of the capitalist economy, whether it's improving, whether it's likely to be in a weak position and have a slump, That's why you must look at those particular areas. That's my explanation of the law of the tendency of rate of property fall and why it is important to understand within the capitalist economy.
Thank you very much. So I promised the audience a chance to write their questions. It seems like our event has caught the attention of several spamming bots. I don't know where they came from, but the technical group has now managed to drive them off. So you can try again to post comments if you'd like in below the stream on the Facebook event. But I already have someone written down here, and I will take them together if that's okay with you, Michael.
Yeah.
So we have the first question from Corina Lutz. Can you explain how the UK and other states will repay the billions they are currently borrowing from global money markets? Can these sums ever be recovered through taxation or other means with a shrunken global economy? And is there a political dimension? That is, how would this indebtedness affect a non-neoliberal dominated economy? And Corina has another question. She says, thank you very much, Michael. You didn't list ending the growth imperative as a top priority. Isn't this needed to refound the global economy on need rather than profit? In the UK, there is no prospect of any anti-neoliberal government, so a democratic revolution is needed to achieve the resetting that Michael proposes. Do you agree?
Well, let me take the debt question first. Yes, as the questioner says, it's been a massive increase in fiscal deficits, as I described, and therefore the level of public debt, but not just public debt, also the corporate debt is dramatically high. So there's a lot more debt. How's that to be paid back? Well, there is a discussion amongst the left economists about you don't need to pay it back. That take the government side for a moment. If government borrows money by issuing bonds to the financial sector and business and so on and households, if you buy a national savings certificate, I don't think that in Norway, you're in fact giving money to the government. So the government is borrowing from you and you get an interest rate on that. Now, if that interest rate is the level of debt servicing that a government has to make in terms of its budget every year, if that's a certain amount, maybe if you raise enough taxes, then you can cover that interest and you don't need to pay back the debt over a period of time. There's a further argument saying, well, you just keep printing more money. You just get the central bank to print more money, and therefore you never have to pay the debt back because governments can print more krona and to pay the owners of this debt over and over again because they control the currency. And if the Norwegian government is never going to go bust, which most people think it won't, then you can go on doing that indefinitely. And even if you've got a very high debt, which is in the case of Japan, their debt is something like 250% of GDP, but it hasn't brought the Japanese government to bankruptcy because that debt continues to be refinanced by yet more debt, and people, the institutions, the financial institutions are prepared to buy that debt in order to keep things going. They make an interest on it, and so the government continues to survive even though the debt continues to rise. So does that mean the debt will never be paid back and there is there to be no crisis of austerity like there was in many countries after 2008-9? Well, I don't think so. To begin with, clearly governments are not going to be in a hurry to make people pay more tax or to cut public services to try and reduce this debt, because they realize that would be politically really bad after what has happened, and certainly from the experience of the Great Recession. So they're going to allow these levels of debt for a while. But the crucial question, and the answer to the question's point is this: if economic growth doesn't pick up, so that there isn't sufficient revenues coming through to the government or to companies so that they can invest and take the economy forward, if that doesn't pick up, then the level of debt servicing is going to rise relatively to the ability of both governments and companies to pay. So at a certain point, there will be a point where governments will have to decide, well, we've got to have to raise taxes to try and pay for this level of debt servicing we've got now, or we're going to have to cut services just as they did before. So we enter a similar period before that we had. You can't go on printing money indefinitely, because eventually what will happen is that will be such a large amount of cash in the system that it won't bring the governments into bankruptcy, but it will mean the currency of each country will fall dramatically, and therefore inflation will come through in economies, and the result will be that workers will have to pay through inflation rather than through taxation. The result is more likely, if you have both policies, that you end up with higher inflation hitting workers' pay packets and higher taxes in workers' pay packets. We can be sure that if governments feel they've got to pay down this debt to some extent, or if companies feel they've got to pay down their debt, they're going to make workers pay for it through their wages and through their employment, and not through taxation on capitalists and the big companies at all. Which brings me to the second question. I laid out some of the things that we need to do as an alternative to what's going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years as a result of the pandemic under a capitalist system. And the questioner rightly says, how can you expect that to be achieved, say, in a country like the UK, which has a right-wing conservative government, or for that matter in Norway if it was necessary? And the answer is you can't. You need, as you say, a democratic transformation, revolution in the system, which brings into office or into power a radical government backed by working people fervently and enthusiastically to carry through sharp changes in a radical redistribution and irreversible change in the social structure of the economy to achieve that. So economics then becomes politics, and politics becomes economics. This is the discussion by a Marxist economist who doesn't talk about politics too much, but nothing can be separated in that way, as the question directly and correctly asks.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you about the environmental consequences of the current situation. There's a number circulating around, I don't remember from where, but saying that we will most likely burn 6% less CO2. There will be 6% less CO2 emissions due to the corona situation. And that really doesn't sound like a lot. It doesn't sound to be like the big number we need to get on the right track. For example, if we need to if we want to get to the Paris goals, for example. So in Norway, we've seen that some of the things our government did was to slash the taxes in the fossil industry, saying that this was needed to secure the production and also the jobs. But so we see that these two crises, the crisis of global warming and the corona crisis, most governments today don't try to fix one of them by worsening the other and going only further into a path of climate destruction. So my question is, what demands should be made from social movements and also the left to tackle these two major challenges at the same time?
Well, the first thing to say, I agree that the pandemic lockdowns have led to a reduction in the first half of 2020 in CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. And we know why that is, because transport is ground to a halt. Airlines are not flying. Travel has been reduced dramatically. Because the economy has gone down, the level of power generation has fallen. So we have a lot of reduction in pollution and also of carbon emissions. But it's only been a brief time. And already, as the economies recover, the carbon emissions are beginning to rise. And as you said, Peter, 6% is nothing, because such is the growth in carbon emissions over the last 50 years and on an accelerating pace, to go down 6%, even if that was sustained, would only take us back to the levels of carbon emissions that we had 2 or 3 years ago. It's nothing. So that, and if we're now going to come back to an accelerating growth in carbon emissions, as I said in the presentation, there's now a 1 in 5 chance within the next 5 years that the world economy will see an increase in temperatures on average across the world of more than 1.5% of centigrade than the levels of pre-industrial times. And that is what scientists at the Paris Agreement said will be the threshold for danger for the planet ahead. So the COVID pandemic is just a brief pause, a very brief pause in terms of dealing with this before everything starts back towards disaster again. What is the policy that we've got to adopt? Well, clearly a policy which cuts the taxes for the fossil fuel industry, or as in the case of the US, allows oil exploration to carry ahead without any controls or regulation, and so on. In other words, most governments around the world that either depend very much on the fossil fuel industry or expect their political support from the owners of the fossil fuel industry are doing nothing about controlling this major area of carbon emissions that takes place. Fossil fuels, as we know, because it's the main carbon generator in every its form, whether it ends up in transport, whether it ends up in power generation, whether it ends up in other areas, is the cause of this global warming. So clearly, we have to phase out the fossil fuel industry. We have to reduce fossil fuel production down and down and down. We have to replace it with alternatives for energy production and so on in the renewables, in solar, wind, hydro, possibly nuclear, all that also has its own dangers. We need a completely different approach to the way in which we generate energy. And also we need to reorganize our energy production. It's totally wasteful, extravagant, wild, without any control but under a capitalist economy. We need public ownership of the energy industry. We need to reorganize it within a plan so it produces on a sustainable basis without carbon emissions in order to meet the social needs of people rather than the profits of these big companies, particularly the fossil fuel ones, but also the mineral exploration ones and others, as I was talking about before, which is destroying our planet and nature in general. So the key question then is ownership and control of the carbon emitters, which aren't households so much. Our industry needs to be under the democratic control of governments internationally so that we can begin to plan for need and reduction and the phasing out of fossil fuel industry. Do people lose their jobs? Well, no. If we have a plan for employment and the transfer of jobs away from the fossil fuel industry into renewables and other areas of the green economy, which we can have, there's plenty of employment possibilities there. And if that would have to be through a plan, then we can do that without people having to lose their livelihoods and their jobs as a result. Naturally, unions in the fossil fuel industry are pretty unlikely to believe that, where they have the present governments that they have at the moment, so they continue to support the idea of maintaining the industry. But it's not in the interest of the world as a whole. We have to change that position, and we have to win over workers in that industry to recognize them. But they will only be won over if they can really see a plan that would work, that will maintain their futures just as much as the rest of us.
Thank you again. So we are beginning to come to an end. I will ask a couple more questions if it's all right with you, Michael, and then we will wrap it up before 8 o'clock. So Dennis O'Neill asks whether you have any thoughts on the utility and limits of modern monetary theory in the current stage of the depression, and also Truls Våler Christiansen asks whether what is the most notable difference in how social economical and non-social economical countries have handled the crisis when it comes to the outcome of economical aid to the private sectors. Yes.
Very good questions. Modern monetary theory, well, it's going to be difficult to explain that in a short time, what my views are. I do recommend that you look at my blog, because there's a number on the Michael Roberts blog, there's a number of essays that I've done on modern monetary theory, where I analyze it, both in its positive aspects and its negative ones. Just to say briefly that its positive aspects are simply that it points out that there is no reason why we need austerity in order to pay the public sector debt. If governments want to borrow, they can do that by printing money, as I said before, in order to meet an emergency like we have in the COVID pandemic and so on. And there is no reason to try and balance the budget in governments. It's not a household, it's an economy, and it depends on how you use our resources and how we expand the money supply in such a way to benefit people. But the negative side of that is that that's really the end of what modern monetary theory says. It says that we don't need to issue bonds, we can print money, we can keep governments going to spend. But what are they going to spend it on when we still have a capitalist system, the big monopolies controlling the bulk of the economy, its employment and its investment? Are governments just going to give money to these monopolies through printing money so that they can continue as they were before? Or are we going to change the social structure of that economy? Modern monetary theory has nothing much to say on that question. And that is key, because unless we can control the value-creating sectors of the economy, we can't transform society to maintain full employment, to sustain it. It's not an answer just to print money as a solution without touching what's the basic social structure of the economy. That's briefly my argument, both the plus and the minus. But if you want to go into the more detailed aspects of MMT and its exponents and what they said, I recommend you look at the blog. The question of, as I said more briefly in the presentation, yes, those economies with governments where we have a proper public health system, where they've been able to use the resources of that public health system to have mass testing, to have the equipment, to have hospital capacity, to look for solutions to the medical thing, and imply particularly public cooperation in controlling the virus in isolation, in quarantining and so on. Those governments who have operated, have had that facility and resource, have succeeded in controlling the virus broadly. China is the best example. Although it started there and the pandemic started in Wuhan, very quickly the Chinese were able to use the social support of the population through a massive public health and testing system to control the virus, and after a short period of time, to remove the lockdown and return to some normality. Countries that didn't have that have weak public health systems, have privatized them, have decimated them, believe in the market's a solution. In the case of the UK, for example, even testing, even equipment and so on has been outsourced to private companies and made a complete hash of it. The private health sector, which is far too large in the UK, played no role in helping to deal with this pandemic. The government has been unable to achieve the task of controlling infections and reduce the death rate. So, for example, China has ended up with 3 per million death rate and a recovery from growth because it has a publicly owned state system where the public support social need, or system support social need in these situations rather than profit, while the UK and the US have 600 deaths per million, and they've suffered anything between 10 and 20% collapse in their GDP. So we can see a significant difference between those economies, China, Vietnam, Taiwan and Korea too, and New Zealand to some extent, who have very low levels of death rate and have recovered a bit, although only China's really recovered in the economic sense, and all those countries down the other end of the spectrum, which have had huge drops in GDP and have failed to protect the population at the same time. There's not been a trade-off between saving lives and livelihoods. That's often argued here. If you hadn't had the if you hadn't had the lockdown, you may have had more deaths, but at least we'd have had the economy going. No, the lockdowns have saved more lives than having no lockdowns. Not the best way of doing it, but they have. But they've also enabled some economies to recover because the lockdowns have been effective, so that their economies have recovered better. Those economies that haven't done a proper lockdown, have not protected their population, have not provided the health service, and also not saved lives, and therefore not recovered from their economies. There is no trade-off. that is the conclusion we can reach from the experience of COVID-19 so far.
Okay, thank you so much. I see now that our schedule says that we are to stop at 8 o'clock, and I thank you very much for a thorough and very informative presentation. I hope that all of you viewing this conversation today, go ahead and read Michael Roberts' blog, thenextrecession.wordpress.com. It's been very interesting to follow that platform now ever since the outbreak of the coronavirus, when I first discovered it. And I want to thank you again for taking your time to give us a deeper insight into the magnitude of the situation that we are facing, and also to giving very inspiring points on what needs to be done and what way we could go to get out of the current situation. So thank you, Michael.
And thank you, Peter and GNIST, for inviting me to speak. It's been invigorating. I know I can't see anybody, but at least we have the opportunity to discuss these things, and I hope that in future we'll have further discussions about what's happening around the world, but also in Norway, and other questions that we can discuss as we go.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.